I'm going to tell you something that was hard for me to admit. For years, I read Genesis 3 as if it were a children's tale. A serpent, an apple, a deceived woman, a silent man, and the guilt of all humanity hanging from a tree. That was the version they taught me in Sunday school. That was the version I saw in the movies. That was the version I repeated 1,000 times without thinking. Until one day, reading the text in Hebrew, I stopped on a single word, 3 letters, Nun, Het Shin, Najash, and I discovered that I had been reading it wrong all my life. Because that word does not only mean serpent, it means 3 things at the same time. And when you understand the 3, you realize that the being that spoke with Eve in the garden was not a reptile crawling among the leaves. It was something much higher, much more brilliant, much more dangerous. And before you think this is a conspiracy theory or something invented by some YouTuber wanting to go viral, let me tell you who has defended this reading, because the list is going to surprise you. Irenaeus of Lyon, 2nd century, disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John. Tertullian, 3rd century, father of Latin theology. Origen, 3rd century, the most brilliant Christian intellect of his era. Jerome, 4th century, the translator who gave the world the Latin Vulgate. Augustine of Hippo, 4th and 5th centuries, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, Martin Luther, 16th century, John Calvin, 16th century, and in the very 21st century, Dr. Michael Heiser, Hebraist of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in his book The Unseen Realm, published by Lexham Press in 2015. This is not a conspiracy. It is the classical Christian reading that was always there, that was taught in the seminaries for 1,800 years, that many of us simply never saw because we grew up with Bibles in our language that lose the nuances of the original Hebrew. And the most striking thing is this: what I am going to show you today is not a modern invention. It is the reading that the Church Fathers made from the 2nd century. It is what Irenaeus of Lyon wrote 100 years after the death of the Apostle John. It is what Tertullian defended. It is what Origen systematized. It is what Jerome translated when he wrote the word Lucifer in the Latin Vulgate of the year 405. It is what the Hebraist Michael Heiser, with a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin, recovered academically in his book, The Unseen Realm, of the year 2015. And when you finish this video, you are going to have 4 answers that change everything. You are going to know what the word Najash really means. You are going to understand why Eve did not get scared when a being spoke to her. You are going to discover why Paul said that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And you are going to see how all this connects with the cross, with the most ancient promise of the Bible, and with the cosmic war that is still active today. But before starting, I need to tell you something. If you make it to the end, there is a moment in Minute 40 where I am going to show you a verse from Revelation that closes the case forever. Do not miss it, because that verse in Greek leaves no doubt. If this seems interesting to you so far, leave a quick like. That tells the algorithm that more people need to see this investigation. And believe me, what comes next weighs more than what you saw in any other video about Genesis 3. Let us begin at the beginning. But the beginning is not where you think. The Garden of Eden was not simply a beautiful orchard with fruit trees. The Hebrew text describes it using technical words that in the ancient Middle East were reserved for only one thing: the dwelling of a god. Look at this. In Ezekiel 28, verse 13, the prophet describes someone who was, according to his words, in Eden, the garden of God. But in verse 14, that same place is called the holy mountain of God. And in the middle of that mountain, there are stones of fire. This is not rural landscape. This is the language of the divine throne room. When the biblical authors spoke of a garden on a mountain with shining stones, where God walked in the cool of the day, they were not describing a park. They were describing the place where heaven and earth met, the seat of the council of God, the space where the Creator gathered with the celestial beings he himself had created to serve him. And the Old Testament is clear about this. Psalm 82 opens with a phrase that many Christians pass by without noticing. God stands in the divine assembly. In the midst of the gods, he judges. That Hebrew word for gods, Elohim in plural, designates there other celestial beings, not competitors of God, subordinates, members of the council. Psalm 89 verse 7 says it with all the letters. God is feared in the great assembly of the holy ones, terrible to all those who surround him. Who in the heavens can be compared with him, who is similar to the Lord among the sons of the mighty? And the book of Job confirms it. In Job 1 verse 6, we read that there came a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and among them came also Satan, the adversary. Look at what happens in that scene. The sons of God, in Hebrew, B'nai Elohim, the celestial beings of the council, present themselves before the throne. They are not humans, they are spiritual entities. And among them Satan arrives. The Hebrew word is Hasatan, with the article, the adversary, the accuser. It is not a proper name yet in Job. It is a function within the council, and that function includes access to the throne, direct conversation with God, permission to act on the earth within established limits. Are you seeing the picture? Eden was not a farm, it was the palace, and the beings of the divine council had access to it. Some fulfilled their function, and at least one, at some moment, decided not to fulfill it. That is where our character appears. And here is where the translation into your language has been lying to you unintentionally for centuries. Come with me to the exact Hebrew word of the text. Genesis 3, verse 1, first line. 3 letters, NHSH, Nun, Het, Shin, Najash. This 3-letter consonantal root generates, in biblical Hebrew, 3 completely distinct meanings. And this is not me saying it. The Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew Lexicon, published in 1906, says it. The Halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament by Kohler and Baumgartner, revised edition of the year 2000, says it. Strong's Hebrew Concordance says it, meaning one. As a noun, Najash means serpent. This is the literal translation you know. It appears 31 times in the Old Testament. The bronze serpent that Moses lifted up in the desert in Numbers 21. The serpent that Jesus mentioned in John 3 verse 14. That reading is valid, meaning 2. The same consonantal root, vocalized as a verb, Najash, means to practice divination, to whisper an enchantment, to dispense divine knowledge, to observe supernatural signs. It is the word used in Leviticus 19 verse 26, where God forbids Israel to practice divination, and also in Genesis 44 verse 5, where the cup of Joseph is described as an instrument of divination. Same root, same nun het shin, but it is no longer an animal. It is a supernatural act. And here comes the third meaning, which is where the text explodes. The same consonantal root, in its adjectival form, is connected with the word nejoshet. And what does nejoshet mean? It means polished bronze, shining copper, radiant metal, the same consonantal root nun het shin. Why does this matter? Because luminosity in Hebrew theology is a technical marker. It is fixed vocabulary of the ancient Near East to designate divine beings. Look at Daniel 10 verse 6. Daniel sees a celestial being. How does the Hebrew text describe him? His arms and his feet, like the gleam of polished bronze. The exact words are nejoshet kalal, shining bronze, same root as Najash. Look at Ezekiel 1 verse 7. the living beings that surround the throne of God. Their feet were like calf's feet, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Again, Najash. Again, Najash in its root. And now ask yourself the question: what is the probability that the author of Genesis, writing in Hebrew, chose at random exactly the word Najash, knowing that that root also means diviner and also means a being of shining bronze? Do you really believe it is coincidence? Dr. Michael Heiser, Hebraist who dedicated his life to the study of the ancient Middle East, proposed in his book The Unseen Realm, chapters 10 and 11, that the author of Genesis 3 is using what in linguistics is called a triple entendre, a word that is loaded intentionally with three simultaneous meanings: the serpent that is a serpent, the serpent that is a diviner, the serpent that is shining. And let me tell you something that happens every day in Christian universities around the world. Imagine this: a theology student, first semester, 20 years old. He's in a class on biblical Hebrew. The professor writes on the blackboard the three Hebrew consonants, Nun Het Shin, and he asks the class, "What does this mean?" Everyone responds, "Serpent." The professor nods, and then he writes the same root next to it, vocalized in another way. And he says, "And this, silence." And then he writes the third one, and he says, "And this, more silence." The professor smiles and says a phrase that student will remember the rest of his life. The Bible has three layers: the one you read in your language, the one your pastor read in the seminary, and the one the original author wrote. And only the three together give you the complete image. That is exactly what is happening in Genesis 3. And very few Christians know it. And this explains something that always bothered you about the text, although perhaps you never formulated it in words. I'm going to ask you a question. When Eve, newly created, in a garden that she understood as the dwelling of God, sees an animal approach and begin to speak to her, what should her natural reaction be? Fright, surprise, astonishment. Any human being would react that way before a talking animal. It would be the first animal speaking in all of history, an absolute rarity. But the biblical text shows no fright. Eve responds with calm. She dialogues, she discusses theology, she presents arguments, as if she were before someone with whom she could converse face to face. Stop there. Process that. Eve did not get scared. Why did she not get scared? Because the being that approached her was not below her. It was above. It was not an animal of the field that suddenly acquired a voice. It was a member of the divine council, a shining being, a celestial enchanter, someone she had seen before in the garden because that was his natural habitat. And you do not need to be a Hebraist to see this. The Apostle Paul himself, a Pharisee Jew formed at the feet of the Rabbi Gamaliel, according to Acts 22 verse 3, confirms it for you with all the letters. 2 Corinthians 11 verse 14, original Greek text. Otos garho satanas metaschematizetai eis angelon photos, literal translation. Because Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Stop on the exact word that Paul chose. Photos, genitive of phos, light, not darkness, light, brightness, splendor. Why did Paul, speaking of Satan, choose the word light as his natural disguise? Why did he not choose darkness, obscurity, shadow? Paul did not go to the lexicon at random. Paul wrote for believers who already had in their heads the image of a shining being, a radiant being, a being who in the Garden of Eden appeared not as a vermin, but as something that seemed worthy of being listened to. And this, let me tell you with all honesty, is exactly what continues happening today. Look at your phone screen right now. Open Instagram, open TikTok, open Twitter. What do you see? Brilliant influencers, smiling spiritual teachers, religious leaders with thousands of followers preaching an easy gospel without the cross, without repentance, without Christ crucified. Messages that sound good. verses out of context, promises of prosperity without sanctification, half-truths served in 15-second capsules. Paul is warning you from the first century. The form of deception is not ugly. The form of deception is luminous, attractive, convincing. That is why it is deception. If it were obviously bad, no one would follow it. The Najash did not approach Eve as a monster. He approached as a being of light, wise, offering divine knowledge. And the modern Najashim do not approach you as demons. They approach as teachers, as gurus, as influencers, as famous pastors with perfect smiles and bestseller books. Paul ends 2 Corinthians 11 in verse 15 with the phrase, "few preach." So it is no surprise if his ministers also disguise themselves as ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. There are disguised ministers. There are false lights. And learning to distinguish them is one of the most important spiritual lessons you are going to have in all your life. And here is where the story begins to open deeper layers. Because the inevitable question is this: if the Serpent of Eden was a shining being of the divine counsel, when did he fall? Why did he fall? And where does the Bible say that? If you have made it this far, give the video a like. That helps more people who are investigating these themes find this investigation, and I assure you that what comes is even more impactful. Let us go to Isaiah chapter 14, and here I need you to pay attention, because I am going to show you something that almost no one knows about the word Lucifer. Isaiah 14 verse 12, in the original Hebrew. Aik nafalta mishamayim, Hillel ben Shashar. How have you fallen from heaven, O Hillel, son of the dawn? This word Hillel is what in Hebrew is called a hapax legomenon. It appears exactly once in all of the Hebrew Bible. Once, in this verse, in no other place. And it derives from the root halal, which has two semantic fields. It means to shine, to gleam, and it also means to praise, to glorify oneself, to boast. Hillel, translated, means the brilliant one, the resplendent one, the one who shines, the son of the dawn. Now here is where the story becomes fascinating. In the year 405 after Christ, the monk Jerome finished the translation of the Bible into Latin. This translation was called the Vulgate. When Jerome arrived at Isaiah 14:12, he translated Hillel ben Shachar into Latin as Lucifer. And here comes what almost no one has told you. Lucifer was not originally the name of the devil. Lucifer is a compound Latin word. Lux means light. Fere means to carry, to bear. Lucifer means bearer of light. And in the Roman Latin of the 4th century, Lucifer was the name given to the planet Venus when seen before dawn, the morning star. And this is going to surprise you. Jerome uses the word Lucifer in Latin, also in other places of the Bible that have nothing to do with Satan. In Job 11, verse 17, Lucifer simply means the dawn. In Job 38, verse 32, it designates a constellation. And in 2 Peter 1, verse 19, the Vulgate uses the word Lucifer to refer to Christ, calling him the morning star that rises in our hearts. Yes, you read correctly. Lucifer in the Latin Vulgate is also a name of Christ, and there was even a Christian bishop of the 4th century named Saint Lucifer of Cagliari, who died in the year 370. Imagine being called that today. So, when did Lucifer become a proper name of the devil? That transition was consolidated by later tradition. Origen, in his work On First Principles, Book 1, Chapter 5, Section 5, written around the year 230, was the first to systematize the reading of Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 as descriptions of the primordial fall of Satan. Tertullian, in his Adversus Marcionum, did the same. Augustine of Hippo, in the City of God, Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica, but the moment that crystallized the image of Lucifer in the Christian imagination was much more recent. Year 1667. England. A blind poet named John Milton publishes an epic poem of 12 books titled Paradise Lost. In Book 1, lines 80 onward, and in Book 5, lines 659 to 60, Milton portrays Lucifer as an archangel of dazzling glory who rebels against God out of pride and pronounces the most famous phrase of English literature, "Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven." Stop a second here, because this is going to shock you. Almost everything the average Christian thinks he knows about Lucifer, about how he looked before falling, about how he rebelled, about the legions of angels that followed him, about the war in heaven, about the divine debate, about the final humiliation, almost everything does not come from the Bible, it comes from Milton. Milton synthesized Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, Revelation 12, and the first book of Enoch into a single, unified narrative. And that narrative irreversibly molded the way the West reads the Bible. The paintings of William Blake, the sculptures of Gustave Doré, the Hollywood movies, the video games, the popular theology books, everything, to a greater or lesser degree, is drinking from the poetic imagination of Milton, not from the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts. Does this mean that the reading is false? No. It means that you have to distinguish what the text says from what tradition says. The patristic tradition from Origen, sustained for 1,800 years, reads Isaiah 14 as a description of the fall of Satan behind the king of Babylon. Modern scholars like John Oswalt, in his Nicot commentary on Isaiah of 1986, prefer to read it only as historical satire against a human king. Heiser and others sustain a dual reading. What is important is this: the text of Isaiah 14:12 says that there fell from heaven a shining being, son of the dawn, who said in his heart, "I will ascend to heaven, and I will be like the Most High." That is what the text says. The word Lucifer is the Latin translation of the Hebrew word Hillel, and the meaning is exactly the same. The one who was shining wanted to be more than God, and for that he was thrown down. Now, before continuing, you need to know something that archaeologists discovered in 1929 and that changes the entire reading of Isaiah 14. On the coast of Syria, there is an ancient city called Ras Shamra. In 1929, a French archaeologist named Claude Schaeffer began to excavate what turned out to be the Canaanite city of Ugarit. And among the rubble, they found thousands of clay tablets written in a Semitic language very similar to biblical Hebrew. Those tablets contained the complete Canaanite mythology, lost for 3,000 years. Imagine for a moment the scene. 1929. Schaeffer and his team digging in a small hill called Tel Ras Shamra, 11 kilometers north of Latakia, Syria. They had spent weeks without finding anything significant. And suddenly, the shovels touch something hard. They begin to take out tablets of baked clay, hundreds, thousands, covered with a cuneiform writing that did not resemble anything known. It took years to decipher it. When they finally succeeded, they realized that they had in their hands the religious library of a Canaanite kingdom of the second millennium before Christ. And inside that library there were stories that illuminated, chapter by chapter, the Old Testament. One of those stories is the cycle of Baal and Anat. And inside that cycle there is a minor god called Athtar. Athtar means the terrible, the imposing one. Athtar is identified in South Arabian and Canaanite inscriptions with the planet Venus, the morning star. And what does Athtar do in Ugaritic mythology? When the principal god Baal dies temporarily, Athtar tries to take the divine throne on Mount Zaphon, the sacred mountain of the Canaanite gods. He climbs to the throne, but upon sitting down he discovers that he is physically too small. His feet do not reach the footstool. His head does not touch the back. Humiliated, he descends from the throne and goes down to govern the land below, the underworld. Now read Isaiah 14 verse 13 and 14. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. On high, beside the stars of God, I will raise my throne. I will sit on the mountain of the assembly, on the farthest sides of Zaphon. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Did you catch that? The exact words. To ascend to heaven, throne above the stars. Mountain of the assembly, Zaphon, the Most High. Isaiah is using deliberately the language of the Ugaritic myth of Athtar to describe what happened with the shining being, and the ancient readers, who knew that mythology perfectly, immediately understood the reference. He was not inventing images. He was using a cosmic language that his audience recognized as a description of a divine being fallen from pride. This is documented in multiple academic works. John Day, in his book Yahweh and the Gods and Goddesses of Canaan, published by Sheffield Academic Press in the year 2000. Peter Craigie, in Ugarit and the Old Testament, published by Eerdmans in 1983, and Hugh Page, in The Myth of Cosmic Rebellion, published by Brill in 1996. And in case any doubt remains for you that Isaiah is speaking here of something more than a human king, let Jesus himself confirm it for you. Luke 10 verse 18, Greek text. Ithiorenton satanan hos astrapen ektu auranu pisonta. Literal translation. I was watching Satan falling from heaven like a lightning bolt. Jesus, in a single phrase, connects the fall from heaven with Satan. The image is exactly the same as Isaiah 14, fall from on high. And Christ, who saw the event, does not need to explain it. He affirms it as a fact. If this is blowing your mind as much as it blew mine when I discovered it, share the video with someone who needs to see this investigation. And give me a quick second of like. What comes now is even stronger, because the second great text about the fall of the shining being is in Ezekiel chapter 28, and here you are going to see something that almost no preacher mentions. Ezekiel 28 contains two different oracles, and the difference is crucial. Verses 1 through 10, oracle against the prince of Tyre. The Hebrew word is nagwid, human prince, political leader. Earthly language, he says things to him like you are a man and not God, although you believe yourself equal to God. Verses 11 through 19, lamentation against the king of Tyre. The Hebrew word changes. It is no longer nagid, it is melech, and the language changes completely. Look at the words. Verse 13, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Verse 14, you were the anointed cherub, protector. I established you in the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. Verse 15, you were perfect in all your ways from the day you were created. Stop. To what human king can this be applied? Who in human history was in Eden? Who was created perfect without original sin? Who is an anointed cherub? Who walks on stones of fire on the mountain of God? Historically, the king of Tyre during the ministry of Ezekiel was Ithobal III, also called Ethbal. He reigned approximately from the year 591 until 572 before Christ. Ithobal survived a 13-year siege by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, according to the Phoenician annals cited by Flavius Josephus in Against Apian. 13 years. Stop on that number. 13 years of siege. Imagine what it is to live in a besieged city for more than a decade. The walls of Tyre, built on an island 800 meters from the coast. The Babylonian army camped before the sea, trying to cross. The arrows, the hunger, the disease, the dead piling up. And King Ithobal locked in his palace, receiving daily reports while he proclaimed himself as a god, according to the oracle of Ezekiel 28:2. I am a god. On the throne of God I sit in the midst of the seas. Those are the words that the prophet quotes from the mouth of the human king. But Ithobal was not in Eden. Ithobal was not a cherub. Ithobal was not created perfect. And here is where the patristic tradition enters. Tertullian, in Against Marcion, Book 2, Chapter 10, wrote that Ezekiel 28 describes the pride and the fall of the devil behind the king of Tyre. Origen confirms it in On First Principles. Jerome develops it in his commentary on Ezekiel. Modern scholars also discuss this. The British scholar Hector Patmore, in his doctoral thesis at the University of Durham of the year 2008, later published by the publisher Brill in 2012 with the title Adam, Satan, and the King of Tyre, demonstrated that the ancient communities read this text in radically different ways. The rabbis saw Adam or King Hiram. The Septuagint applied it to the Israelite high priest. The church fathers saw Satan. Daniel Block, in his Nikot commentary on Ezekiel, prefers to read the image as a parallel with Adam. But the Christian tradition sustained from the 2nd century and the textual arguments we have just seen support the view that behind the human king of Tyre, his fallen cosmic patron is glimpsed. The cherub who was in Eden, the shining being who filled himself with pride, the one who now disguises himself as an angel of light. Are you seeing the picture? Genesis 3 speaks of a Najash, a shining diviner being, who tempts Eve. Isaiah 14 describes a Hillel, a shining one, who fell from heaven for wanting to be like God. Ezekiel 28 describes an anointed cherub who was in Eden and who was thrown out for pride. And all those texts, separated by centuries, are speaking about the same person. But one question remains: how does this story end? And here is where the Bible gives the most impactful turn of all, because from the first moment, from the first instant after the fall, God did not leave things like that. God pronounced a promise so powerful that 1,900 years later, when a Jewish carpenter was nailed to a Roman cross, that promise was fulfilled to the last letter. The promise is in Genesis 3, verse 15, and Christian theologians call it, since the 2nd century, the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel, the first time in all of the Bible that the plan of salvation is announced. Read the text. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will wound his heel. This sounds simple in your language. In Hebrew, it is much deeper than it seems. Let us go to the key word. Zerah. It means seed, descendants. It is a collective noun. But in this verse, it appears accompanied by a singular masculine pronoun. Whom. He. Not they. Not she. He. Why does this matter? Because in biblical Hebrew, when a collective goes with an individual singular pronoun, the author is pointing to a specific descendant, a person, not a group. This reading is not a later Christian invention. It is a pre-Christian Jewish reading. Look at this. The Septuagint is the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, made by Jewish sages in Alexandria approximately between the year 250 and 100 before Christ. When the Jewish translators arrived at Genesis 3:15, they translated Zerah with the Greek word sperma. But sperma in Greek is neuter gender. Greek grammar required the pronoun auto in neuter. However, the Jewish translators broke the agreement and wrote autos, singular masculine pronoun. This is documented by the scholars J. Michael, R. A. Martin, and W. Wefall. The conclusion is forceful. The individual messianic interpretation of Genesis 3:15 is pre-Christian. It was in the heads of the Jewish rabbis 200 years before Jesus was born, and the Targums confirm it. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an Aramaic translation of the Pentateuch used in the synagogues, paraphrased Genesis 3:15 with these words: "The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, and they will obtain healing for the heel in the days of the Messiah King." The Targum Neophiti says something very similar, and the ancient rabbis affirm it. The Midrash Tanchuma of the 4th or 5th century writes explicitly, "As you went out for the salvation of your people by the hand of the Messiah, son of David, who will wound Satan, the head, the king and prince of the house of the wicked. Before the Christian church existed, the Jewish rabbis were already reading Genesis 3:15 as a messianic promise. The church did not invent this reading, it inherited it, and the first systematic Christian articulation was made by Justin Martyr. Around the year 155, in his dialogue with Trypho, chapter 100, Justin established the typology that would later dominate Christian theology. Eve brought disobedience and death. Mary, the new Eve, brought faith and life. Adam fell. Christ, the new Adam, restored. 20 years later, around the year 175, Irenaeus of Lyon wrote his monumental work against heresies. In Book 3, chapter 18, and in Book 5, chapter 21, Irenaeus developed the classic Christian doctrine of recapitulatio. Christ, on the cross, recapitulated everything that Adam lost on the tree, but in reverse, and he crushed the head of the Najash of Genesis 3. And here is a detail few Christians know about Irenaeus. Irenaeus was not just any theologian. Irenaeus had been a disciple of Polycarp of Smyrna, and Polycarp had been a direct disciple of the Apostle John, the one who wrote the Apocalypse, the one who closes the case of the Najash in 12:9. That means that between Irenaeus and the Apostle John, there is only one person, one. And when Irenaeus writes that the promise of Genesis 3:15 refers to Christ crushing the head of the serpent, he is not inventing anything. He is repeating what he learned from the one who had learned from the apostle himself. That is what is called apostolic tradition, and that is why the messianic and satanological reading of Genesis 3 is not a medieval innovation. It is the reading of the church from the beginning. And so that you see that this reading is absolutely solid, look at what the Apostle Paul writes. Romans 16, verse 20. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. Did you catch the word? Will crush. Same image as Genesis 3:15. Paul is explicitly identifying the primordial promise with the fall of Satan, and he adds it, directing it to the entire church. Under your feet. The church, united with Christ, participates in the crushing. But the final confirmation, the one that closes the case forever, is in the last book of the Bible. In the book that traditionally is read least, in the book of images, the Apocalypse. If you have made it this far, and if this has made you see the Bible with other eyes, give a like to this video. What follows is the moment where the entire investigation closes, and believe me, you are not going to forget it. Apocalypse chapter 12, verse 9, original Greek text. Kai eblete ho dracono megas, ho opis ho archaios, ho kalumenos diabolos kai, ho satanas, ho planon ten oikumenon holen. Literal translation. And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, called the devil and Satan, the seducer of the whole world. But before you continue, put yourself in the place of the Apostle John for a moment. Year 95 after Christ, approximately, John is exiled on a rocky island called Patmos in the Aegean Sea. He is more than 90 years old. He is the last living apostle. All the others died as martyrs. Peter crucified upside down in Rome, Paul beheaded, James stoned. Only John remains, old, weak, in a cave on the island, and there, in that solitude, he sees the most impactful vision of the Bible. He sees a cosmic woman clothed with the sun. He sees a red dragon with 7 heads that tries to devour the newborn son. And in verse 9, John, the beloved disciple, the one who rested his head on the chest of Jesus during the Last Supper, makes the final equation. He closes the circle that Genesis 3 opened. He identifies the dragon with the ancient serpent, with the devil, with Satan. There is no way to read this and doubt. John, who knew Genesis in Hebrew, who knew Isaiah, who had heard from the lips of Christ himself what happened in Eden, makes the final connection. Stop. Process every word. Dragon, cosmic image of the adversary, ho ophis ho archaeos, the ancient serpent, and here is the philological detail that closes the case. The Greek word archaeos, Strong's 3744. It does not simply mean old. If it meant old, the word palaios would be used. Archaeos means primeval, original, from the beginning, the original serpent, the first serpent, the one of Eden, diabolos, devil, the accuser, Satanas, Satan, the adversary, hoplanon, the one who deceives. Did you see it? The Apostle John, in the last book of the canon, makes the explicit and absolutely unequivocal equation. The serpent of Eden is the dragon of the apocalypse, is the devil, is Satan. And if you have any doubt, read Apocalypse 22. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years. Twice. The identification is repeated twice, so that no ambiguity remains. You do not need to be a Hebraist. You do not need to resolve the debate about Najash. You do not need to decide whether Haisa is right or not. Apocalypse 12:9 in Greek makes the final connection, and the case is closed. And even before Christianity, the connection was already made in Judaism. The Book of the Wisdom of Solomon, written in Alexandria, approximately in the 1st century before Christ, says in chapter 2, verse 24, "Through the envy of the devil, death entered the world." This is a direct allusion to Eden, and it proves that the Jews of the Second Temple already identified the serpent with the devil 200 years before the cross. But now comes the final twist, the one that recontextualizes everything you have seen. Because if you understand who the serpent really was, then you understand something even more profound. You understand the cross. Look at the pattern. The serpent of Eden was shining. He wanted to be like the Most High. He wanted to ascend to the mountain of the assembly. He wanted to sit on the throne of God, but upon trying to elevate himself, he was thrown down. Christ was the Most High. He is the true morning star. According to Apocalypse 22:16, he is the light of the world, according to John 8:12. But Christ, according to Philippians 2 verses 6 through 8, did not consider being equal to God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. He humbled himself, becoming obedient unto death and the death of the cross. Did you catch the inversion? The shining one who wanted to elevate himself fell. The true shining one voluntarily descended. The serpent tried to usurp the throne. Christ renounced his, and by renouncing it, he recovered everything. Hebrews 2 verse 14, so that through death he might destroy the one who had the power of death, that is, the devil. 1 John 3 verse 8, for this purpose the Son of God was manifested, to undo the works of the devil. Romans 16:20 again. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. The promise of Genesis 3:15 was fulfilled at Calvary. The head of the ancient serpent was crushed when a Roman nail pierced the heel of Christ, and the inversion is perfect. What seemed like the victory of the adversary was the definitive victory of the Messiah. I want you to see something in that image. An image that is worth more than 1,000 sermons. On the mountain of the assembly, the shining being wanted to ascend and was thrown down. On Mount Calvary, the true Son of the Most High was lifted up on a cross, and by being lifted up, he drew all to himself. By being nailed, he freed all. By dying, he killed death. By being wounded in the heel, he crushed the head of the Najash, who 1,900 years earlier whispered to Eve in a garden. And this, what I am going to tell you now, is the most important of everything you have seen in this video. If you read Genesis 3 and only see a serpent, you miss the war. But if you read Genesis 3 and understand that the being that spoke with Eve was shining, was intelligent, was a deceiver, was a fallen member of the divine council, then you begin to see something that changes your complete reading of the Bible. You begin to see that the Bible is not a collection of moral tales. It is the chronicle of a cosmic war, a war that began before you were born, a war in which you are already involved, whether you know it or not. And you begin to understand why Paul wrote in Ephesians 6, verse 12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." These are not metaphors. These are real forces, and the battle is active. But you also begin to understand why Christ said in John 16:33, "Be of good cheer. I have overcome the world," because the head was already crushed. The sentence was already pronounced. The Najash was already defeated on the cross. What remains is the final fulfillment, when according to Apocalypse 20:10, the devil is thrown into the lake of fire forever. Meanwhile, there is something you can do now, today, in this moment. You can stand on the correct side of the war. Imagine this scene, Sunday morning, a full church. The music plays, the lights are perfect, everyone sings with their hands raised. And in the middle of the service, an elder of the congregation opens his Bible and whispers in the ear of the one beside him, "Look at this." And he points him to Genesis 3:15. The first promise, the one that was fulfilled on the cross. The other man, who had come to church for the first time in years because his marriage was falling apart, reads the verse. And for the first time in a long time, he understands. He understands that the war he lives in his house, the fights, the frustration, the exhaustion, is not only a human war, it is the shadow of a much more ancient war. And he understands for the first time that the solution is not to try harder. The solution is to hold on to the one who already crushed the head of the ancient serpent. That is the difference this text makes. When you understand the Najash, you understand that your life is part of a greater story. Because in this story, there are only two types of people. Those who follow the Najash, allowing themselves to be seduced by the promise of being like God without God. And those who follow the true Son of the Most High, who humbled himself to lift you up. Genesis 3 is not only the beginning of the problem, it is the beginning of the solution. And the solution is called Jesus. When you read Genesis 3 with the eyes of a child, you see a serpent and an apple. When you read Genesis 3 with the eyes of the original Hebrew, you see the shining Najash. When you read Genesis 3 with the eyes of the Apocalypse, you see the dragon already defeated. And when you read Genesis 3 with the eyes of Calvary, you see the promise fulfilled in blood. The ancient serpent was defeated. The first gospel was fulfilled. The cross was planted in the exact place where the tree of knowledge had become a tree of death, and the tree of death was transformed by the blood of the Lamb into the tree of life. Think about that for a second. Think about what it means. In Eden there was a tree. Man ate from the wrong tree and died. On Calvary there was another tree, the Roman cross, made of wood. The second Adam, Christ, was hung on that tree. And by being hung, he rescued humanity. The tree that killed the first one was the path to the tree that gave life to the second. And the verse that closes everything is in Apocalypse 22:2. In the middle of the street of the New Jerusalem is the tree of life that produces 12 fruits, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Did you catch the perfect symmetry? The forbidden tree of Genesis 3 becomes the tree of Calvary, which becomes the tree of life in the Apocalypse. 3 trees, one single story. And everything revolves around the moment when the shining Najash whispered the first lie and the war began. That is the story that the Hebrew text wanted to tell you. That is the story that the translation into your language almost hid from you. That is the story that Irenaeus understood in the 2nd century, that Paul understood in the 1st century. that the rabbis of the Targum understood before Christ, that Heiser recovered academically in 2015, and now that story is yours. If this impacted you, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs to see Genesis 3 with new eyes. And leave me in the comments a single word, the original Hebrew word that changed everything. Najash.